Three archivists uncover a 90-year-old cold case within the boxes of Rabbi Joshua Sperka papers, the brutal murder of a Syrian immigrant, a Jewish man convicted of the crime but proclaiming his innocence, the real murderer perhaps still walking the streets. To unearth clues that have remained hidden for so long, Brian, Laura, and Rabbi, three archivists with the Center for Michigan Jewish Heritage, will dig through archival records, court cases, genealogy records, and more on this season of A Bisel of History, Murder Mystery. Previously on A Bisel of History, Murder Mystery. Mortado Abraham is found dead in his bed of a gunshot wound. Because of his contentious relationship with his ex-wife, Zinab, she is questioned by the police. So is her lover, Sam Hazimi. Hazimi points the finger at another man, Louis Gross. Gross's motive? Payment over a rug. Though Zinab and Gross are both tried for the murder, only Gross is convicted.
As chaplain to the Jewish prisoners of Michigan, one of Rabbi Joshua Sperka's duties was to counsel the men and women. We have to imagine that Sperka was told many outlandish tales during his time as chaplain, but Louis Gross's story was a bit different. By Sperka's appointment in 1941, Gross had already been in jail nearly a decade, and he'd spent every one of those years proclaiming his innocence and fighting for his freedom. During this time in prison, Gross studied the law so that he could write his own appeals. With no money nor help from family, he was on his own. In 1943, he finally got a chance to make his case in court, where he represented himself during a motion for a new trial. Gross presented evidence from several detectives and prosecutors from across the case who believed he'd been framed. Even Zinab Abraham and her son testified they believed Gross was innocent. Still, his motion for a new trial was denied. Some people might have given up hope at this point, but not Louis Gross.
Throughout the years, Sperka had tried to interest lawyers in Gross's case, but to no avail. Seeing no other options, Sperka reached out to an unexpected choice, a pulp magazine. Argosy Magazine, founded in 1882, ran a popular column called The Court of Last Resort. This column investigated the cases of prisoners who maintained their innocence. It was written by none other than Erle Stanley Gardner, author of the Perry Mason series. Rabbi Sperka pleaded with Argosy and Gardner to take on Louis Gross's case. It was a long-shot request and one that paid off. Having read Rabbi Sperka's letter, Gardner reached out to Gross and asked to meet. The date was January 12, 1949. By this time, Gross had been in prison for 16 years. Gardner was quick to limit Gross's expectations, though. There were no guarantees that they were going to take on the case. Their meeting was merely informational. Plus, as Gardner told Sperka, the expense to take on such a case was enormous. Just two of their previous cases had cost more than $20,000, and that's with investigators donating their time. Back in 1949, $20,000 would be the equivalent of $240,000 today. That's a lot of money to spend on someone you like, but Gardner was not much of a fan of Louis Gross as a person.
In a letter to Rabbi Sperka, which Gardner wrote after meeting Gross, Gardner referred to Gross as human flotsam. He even added, quote, "As an individual, he is certainly not worth the effort of having a magazine employ criminologists and detectives to investigate his case." So why didn't Gardner's interest end there? What made him pursue a case for a man he deemed as floating wreckage? Two reasons. The first is that he too found the facts of the case and Gross's conviction more than a little suspicious. Between the missing case files, flimsy evidence, and unreliable witnesses, Gardner believed there was more to the story, saying, quote, "I am inclined to believe that Louis Gross was convicted partially because of a previous criminal record and partially because he was a Jew." The second reason was Rabbi Joshua Sperka. The relationship that blossomed between Gardner and Sperka could be described as an epic friendship. In the many pieces of correspondence between the two, we see the mutual respect and admiration that developed.
Gardner himself stated that Sperka was a major contributing factor in taking on the case. While in Michigan to visit Gross, Gardner spent time at the Sperka family home. He he recounted his visit to his readers. Rabbi Sperka is the one who really sparked this Gross case. He's active and full of bounce as a tennis ball in a championship match. Not only does he have a large congregation in Detroit, but in addition to that, he does chaplain work all over the state. Despite the fact we contacted him on one of his busiest days, we managed to work in a very satisfactory visit. In between ringing telephones and procession of callers, although afterwards we felt as though we'd been riding on the coattails of a jet bomber.
Gardner also recounted a memory Sperka shared with him about experiencing a pogrom as a small child in Poland, about which Gardner said, quote, "Hearing a first-hand account of these things, one can well shudder at the end product of racial and religious intolerance. No sacrifice is too great to see that we, in this country, learn the dangers which lurk in intolerance, whether it be of race, creed, or color." Gardner's reflection gives us insight into his motivation to fight injustices. Gardner was not the only person investigating the case. He consulted with Raymond Schindler, a well-known detective and head of Schindler National Detective Agency in New York, Leonard Keeler, co-inventor of the polygraph, and Dr. Lemoyne Snyder, a famous medical criminologist. This was the crack team Louis Gross had been waiting for. But first, he had to wait for the readers of Argosy.
Still with some trepidation about taking on the case, Gardner brought the story to the court of last resort. In an article he submitted in May of 1949, Gardner laid out the facts of the case as he knew them and asked the readers of Argosy a very important question. Quote, "Is this case bigger than the personality of Louis Gross, a bit of human flotsam sucked into the vortex of a conspiracy by sinister influences of great political power? Or should we search for a more worthy subject? What is your verdict?" Whether Gardner and his team continued their investigation and the fate of Louis Gross was now in the hands of Argosy readers, and all Louis Gross could do was wait. Next time, we find out if Gardner and his team stay on the case, or if the readers of Argosy also find Louis Gross to be unworthy of insistence. And we will lay out the gathered evidence for you to decide if Louis Gross was really guilty or a victim of a cover-up.
Join us next week on a Bisel of History murder mystery for Episode 4, The Case Against Louis Gross.